Thank you, Dr. Pierce. This next section here, first we'll have Michael Brickman. He's a former Education Policy Advisor for Governor Scott Walker and Policy Director for Fordham Institute. He'll be presenting, and what I'd like to do for this format is, if members of the committee have a question of kind of clarification, please come up. If you have a question of clarification for what he's saying, then please let's do that while he's speaking. But if you have any kind of a substantive question, let's try to hold those to the end of his speech, and then we can talk with him directly. And we'll do that the same with the Board of Education as well. And then we'll have, after that, we'll have a period of general questions for anything that's been covered or anything new as well. Representative Warren, do you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Could you, on the General Statute 115C-174, which outlined or directed the State Board of Ed to continue participation in common core, when was that enacted?
The staff, do you have an exact date on that?
Yes, sir. That was enacted in 2011 through Senate Bill 479.
All right, thank you. All right, Mr. Brickman, please.
Thank you, Chairman Suchek. How's that? All right. Thank you, Chairman Suchek and Chairman Holloway, the other members here, other members and elected officials who have come to hear about this important issue, and members of the public. It's as an education policy nerd, it's kind of nice to see a packed house to talk about education policy. You don't always get that. So I appreciate that in the middle of the day on Tuesday, there's so many people in this state who are interested in these standards and in improving education. So with that, again, as the chairman mentioned, my name is Michael Brickman. I'm the National Policy Director at the Fordham Institute. We focus on a whole range of K-12 education issues, from school choice to standards-based reform, accountability, teacher quality, and a lot of those things you focused on here in the state of North Carolina, which is great to see. Also as education advisor to Governor Walker in Wisconsin until January of 2011 when he took office through just this past August. So seeing some of the reforms that have been enacted in North Carolina in recent months, really, it's interesting to see, and it really does align with a lot of the research that we do at the Fordham Institute. School choice, you've enacted opportunity scholarships, so I think we really allow students to climb the ladder of opportunity when they don't necessarily have access to quality education elsewhere. You've enacted more accountability at both the classroom and the school level to make sure the taxpayers are getting their money's worth and that we're actually delivering a high-quality education in the state. You've reformed tenure and other teacher quality reforms to make sure the system is ultimately focused on children and not the interests of adults as the primary concern. So with that, I do want to just kind of talk briefly about the Common Core, get into a little bit of what it is, what it is not. DPI will be speaking as well, but then really just want to hopefully leave some time for clarifying questions if you have them right away, but then also hopefully at the end will be time for some more in-depth Q&A and we can really get into the heart of the issue. With regard to the Common Core, there's a lot that's being said about the Common Core. I, for one, don't believe that it is necessarily some terrible scourge in education. I also don't believe that, as the New York Times editorial board has said, with all due respect to them, I disagree with them, they've said it's the most important education reform in our country's history. I think deep down the truth is somewhere. This is something that I think will align well with what the state of North Carolina has done in other areas with regard to education reform. And I think as long as it's implemented properly, it will improve education in the state of North Carolina. But following that great presentation on the difference between standards and curriculum and the focus on local control, ultimately, we're not going to have a good education system in this state or any other state unless teachers have the ability to deliver high-quality instruction, and ultimately students are prepared to move from grade to grade and are ultimately prepared for college or the workforce or the military or really some other productive endeavor once they graduate from high school. So a little bit of background on how the Common Core came to be. States, as many of you know, had standards for a long time prior to the Common Core. Unfortunately, many of the standards in North Carolina and elsewhere weren't that good. I'm certainly not picking on North Carolina because my home state of Wisconsin, our standards were worse than the old standards that you had in North Carolina. But we looked at the Fordham Institute state by state, at each state's standards, and compared them with the Common Core. And I'll get in a little bit more to the detail about how those two stack up, but it's also important to know the reason, not just the fact that we say so, but let's look at some of the results for the reason that North Carolina and most other states felt that standards needed to be upgraded. Remediation is a huge concern. For many of our best students who go on to college, they enter college not being able to do college-level work. There's a recent study that showed that North Carolina overspent on remediation costs by $113 million. So by overspending by over $100 million a year, I think that right there is a key piece of evidence showing that in North Carolina, many students left high school not knowing enough material to be able to do college-level work. And so the taxpayers, tuition payers, had to pay twice to reteach college freshmen things that they really should have learned when they were high school seniors or earlier. In addition, folks who want to go and enjoy a career, serve our country in the military, 23% of North Carolina applicants and 36%, that's 23% of all North Carolina applicants, and 36% of African American applicants failed the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Act. That means they were not ready for a career in the military. By not being prepared post-high school, we're denying our children options in the future. Moreover, and I think it's important to point out, that it's not just a product of the standards themselves. The assessments are a problem as well. And there are plenty of states, California is a good example, that had pretty high quality standards, but set the bar very low on the assessments that measure those standards. We did a study called the Proficiency Illusion that looked at a number of different states and found that in a lot of cases, you could be doing worse than 70 or 80% of your peers and still be deemed proficient by the state. That's not an honest picture of what students need to know by the time that they graduate from high school. And ultimately, that's preparing students to meet a bar that's not high enough to prepare them for success later on. We need to make sure students graduate, we need to give them a high school diploma, but that high school diploma needs to be more than a piece of paper. It needs to be actually a ticket to a future where students can be self-sufficient and productive members of society. Recognizing these issues several years ago, 48 states in DC got together and through their membership in the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, which represent the nation's governors and education chiefs, superintendents, depending on what the state calls them, got together and looked at the best of what states were doing. So they collected the best standards from each state, looked at the research, looked at the evidence of what was out there, and developed a higher set of standards that ultimately 45 states in the District of Columbia adopted in 2010. Now, it's important to understand that these standards are a major improvement over what North Carolina had before. In fact, they're a major improvement over what the vast majority of states had before. Some states were a little bit more comparable, but unfortunately North Carolina was not one of them. In English language arts, we looked at the Common Core and rated it a B+. We looked at North Carolina's old standards and rated it a D. And some reasons why. While we said that North Carolina deserves credit for codifying the importance of studying our literary heritage, there weren't often distinctions between literature and nonfiction texts. Moreover, there wasn't really a clear understanding of what students were supposed to do with each type of text. We found that the greatest weakness of North Carolina standards was that there's no priority given to real academic content, which is included along many, many non-academic goals for students. For example, whereas that great presentation before by Dr. Pierce showed what real clear standards look like, North Carolina standards in the past often sounded like this. I'm quoting from North Carolina's old standards. They ask students to reflect on learning experiences by evaluating how personal perspectives are influenced by society, cultural differences, and historical issues, appraising changes in self through the learning process, evaluating personal circumstances and background that shape interaction with text. Now, these may or may not be things that we want students to do, but those are not examples of standards that can really inform a teacher to help students learn. Another set of examples of what we call feel-good standards, and it's interesting, I hope people will pay attention. I've read plenty on blogs about how the Common Core is supposedly focusing on politics or focusing on social issues. You won't find those things in the Common Core. However, I can read directly from North Carolina's old standards. Students in the past were expected to compose reflective texts that give the audience an understanding of complex thoughts and feelings, a sense of significance, social, political, or philosophical implications, and a sense of encouragement to reflect on his or her own ideas. Again, those may or may not be good things for students to know, but those are not appropriate standards for academic learning. Again, overall we rated North Carolina's standards a D, which were among the worst in the country, compared to the Common Core, which was a B+. In math, we also rated North Carolina's old standards a D, whereas the Common Core was rated an A-. On the positive side of North Carolina's old standards, there was a strong focus on conversion between measurement systems, and there were a lot of things like in the high school geometry section. Unfortunately, there were a lot of weaknesses. One of the biggest was that no standard in North Carolina's old standards explicitly stated students must memorize basic facts for multiplication and division. Again, students were not required to learn their basic facts and memorize them for multiplication and division. You must know your multiplication tables from memory. You must know basic division to be able to move on to higher level math. North Carolina did not require it. Moreover, we found that such standards do not ensure students master the standard algorithms, which are, I think, probably the way that you and I mostly learned how to do math, so lining up your numbers and going column by column, adding up the numbers. There was not an explicit focus on standard algorithms. The old North Carolina standards basically just said students have to use, quote, strategies to get the right answer. Common Core specifically focuses on the standard algorithms. North Carolina also did not mention common denominators. If there are math teachers here, if there are people who are focused on math, you need to know how to work with common denominators to be able to do most of higher level math. And finally, quadratic equations we found were not studied thoroughly in the old standards. Again, North Carolina standards were rated a D, among the worst in the nation, whereas the Common Core were rated at an A-. And again, I have to point out, I'm not picking on the state of North Carolina because there were states, including my own state, that were worse. Now, it's not surprising. I know many of you have probably heard from businesses who talk about the skills gap. They have jobs, they can't find people to fill them with the right skills. And that is why many business groups, nationally and in the state of North Carolina, Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable, the North Carolina Chamber, and many of the larger private employers in the state have endorsed the Common Core. In the K-12 arena, the North Carolina PTA, associations representing principals, assistant principals, superintendents, school administrators, and yes, teachers, have endorsed the Common Core, but more importantly, than the associations, the teachers on the ground, according to polling, support the Common Core. A recent poll by Scholastic looked at the degree to which teachers supported or did not support the Common Core in the state of North Carolina, and found that close to 80% thought that implementation of the Common Core would be difficult. But likewise, close to 80% of teachers in the state of North Carolina were enthusiastic about implementation. And over 80%, 83%, thought that the Common Core would have positive impact on some of the very skills that employers are looking for, critical thinking and reasoning, that are so important today. And so while teachers in the state felt that this is something that would be challenging, they think it's a challenge worth taking on. I'm assuming, like most legislators, you have concerns or questions about cost. What is this going to cost the state of North Carolina? What is this going to cost your local school districts? And we did a study on that, and in short, the answer is it depends. But a lot of it depends on how districts implement the standards. Now, if you read the standards, which I definitely encourage all of you to do, you'll probably, if you're like most legislators I've spoken with in a lot of different states, you'll probably assume that these things have been taught in your schools for a long time. But this is nothing new, it's nothing controversial. Look, it all looks very familiar. Basic math, basic reading skills. And I think you'd be right. I think in most schools, most of these skills are being taught, despite the weakness of the standards that I just went over. The problem is that's not the case in all North Carolina schools. And that's the reason that you see such strong achievement gaps, persistent achievement gaps. That's the reason you see students who don't graduate from high school or graduate from high school but without any kind of readiness for post-secondary work. And so for the districts that have a longer way to go to get up to the rigor of the Common Core, there might be additional costs. Now, this is something that's been going on for about a year and a half in this state, and so that's something that hopefully is already underway. But for districts that have been doing these things for a long time, our study found that there probably won't be as big a challenge. And in fact, because North Carolina will have access to so many more materials, if you're not Texas, Florida, California, New York, the big states that publishers all trying to publish for, teachers and school districts in the past didn't necessarily have access to that much variety when it came to textbooks, professional development, and things like that. Now, given that the biggest market for education in the country is the states that have aligned to the Common Core, there will be a dramatic increase in the diversity of materials that are available to teachers, to parents, and ultimately to students. And that makes a difference because a lot of those materials are actually free. They're online, they're adaptive, which means they tailor themselves to the progress that a student is making. And so I think there's, and if you look at our study, there's absolutely opportunity for even cost savings at the district level. At the state level, and I know you're considering which assessment should be used to measure student progress. I have not yet seen a study specifically tailored to North Carolina that looks at a variety of different options. Maybe that's something that's underway. But Indiana did take a look at this, and I think is an interesting example. They looked at the cost of using one of the consortium tests, so the Parker Smarter Balance tests, versus kind of going it alone and using a different assessment. Their study found that the cost of leading the consortia would be between $1.5 and $3.5 million extra per year. And because they're going it alone and not relying on the consortia for the startup costs, they would have a one-time startup cost of around $19 to $23.5 million upfront. So that's something to consider, and probably worth noting that North Carolina is a larger state. hard to tell exactly, but you can probably expect those numbers to be larger in North Carolina. I'm sure also that many of you are wondering, because there's so much interest in this issue, because there are some concerns out there, you're probably hearing from constituents on this issue. What are some ways maybe the standards and some of the issues surrounding the standards, how can you improve upon the status quo? And I think it's worth looking at what other states have done. I know there are many people who are concerned about data privacy, myself included. Worth noting up front that you're not going to fix anything with regard to data privacy by only focusing on the standards. The Common Core could go away tomorrow, data privacy concerns would not. And so, regardless of what happens with the assessments, regardless of what happens with the standards, data privacy, student privacy is something that's, I think, probably worth taking a look at. A couple of examples, because of course other states are wrestling with this as well. Oklahoma this year passed House Bill 1989, which further regulates data transfer between organizations both within the state and outside the state of Oklahoma. Further prevents collection of other records like social security numbers, biometric, and other medical information that people don't want out there. Utah's another example that did something kind of different and interesting. They created through Senate Bill 82 what's called a data backpack, which guarantees that any data collected on a student will be available to the parents. So it's a pretty common sense thing that parents should have access to the data that's being collected either at the district level or at the state level on their children. And will ensure that, more than anything, parents know how students are performing academically. Further, other states have taken the Common Core and added to them. Like North Carolina, a lot of states have seen dramatic improvement in their standards and by adopting the Common Core. And while they think maybe there are ways they can improve, don't want to start from scratch. North Carolina teachers were asked to adopt a new set of standards in 2004. They were asked to adopt the Common Core in 2010. A new set of standards would be the third set of standards in 10 years that we're asking teachers to shift gears and now focus on. What other states have done is they've added to the standards. They've taken things that maybe were lost in translation between the old standards and the new ones. And a good example, Pennsylvania did this. Minnesota did this. Other states have done this. So worth looking at what some of those other states have done. But really, I think you all will want to take a North Carolina-centric view. And when you hear from other speakers, when you hear from the public, if there are specific things that people feel have been left out, might be worth looking to make sure that gets included. Finally, there are other kind of odds and ends concerns that are out there. Some, I think, are legitimate. Some are maybe a misinterpretation of what the standards actually are, what they encompass. But other states have tried to put a lot of those concerns to rest. Michigan is a good example, where through a resolution, concurrent resolution, they heard from the public. They took some of the concerns that were out there. And even though not all of the members agreed which concerns were legitimate and which ones were not, they agreed to put those to rest to make sure there were no concerns out there and to make sure data privacy, things like politics in the classroom, were taken care of up front so there was no misinterpretation. Finally, and I know many of you probably have a lot of questions, but just wanted to again point out the fact that this is a major improvement of what North Carolina has had before. And I think there are ways to make it better, but would encourage you to start from where you are and learn from what other states have done to make this the best possible reform for kids. So with that, thank you again for hosting me here. Definitely already seen the Southern hospitality that everybody talks about. It's great to be in this state. Happy to take questions for the chair either now or later, or both. And in the future, happy to be helpful on this issue or any other issue concerning education. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that presentation. We do have, let's shoot for somewhere between 15, 25 minutes as a ballpark as to address issues specifically talked about here in the form that we discussed. So I saw Senator Newton, did you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Brickman. I enjoyed your presentation. I wanted to ask you some questions about the studies that you told us about as far as the teachers' view of Common Core. Because I haven't taken any polls, but just informally, anecdotally in my district, the responses of teachers to me have not been as favorable as the poll that you were telling us about. I want to ask you just a couple questions if I could. Who did the poll, and was this centric to North Carolina? And can we get a copy of the poll and the questions asked? I'd just like to see a little bit more behind that. Perhaps it's being implemented better in other parts of the state than in my district, but that's not been my experience at all.
Sure. So this was a poll conducted by Scholastic. They covered, I think, every state, and it was tens of thousands of teachers nationwide. It was a representative sample size from North Carolina, and so the numbers I cited were specific to North Carolina. And if you'd like, I can get an email address from you later, your staff, and make sure you get a copy of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the study that you presented here, exactly who's determining the grades that you're giving each of the standards? I mean, there's a sentence here that says, the greatest weakness of North Carolina standards is that there's no priority given to real academic content. Who has determined what real academic content is? That's confusing.
I know that there are a lot of passions and a lot of enthusiasm here, but I think it's destructive to the process here to have outbursts and distractions like that. I know that's difficult, but I would ask you to be respectful. If we could just allow the committee to ask these questions and we can proceed forward. If you could keep your enthusiasm internal, I think that would be helpful to what we're trying to accomplish today. Thank you. Mr. Brickman.
Sure, appreciate the question. So this was a combination of some of our internal staff, and there were experts that took the time to look at every single state's standards. And this is something that actually we at Fordham had been doing prior to the existence even of the Common Core. So the goal, just to be clear, is this is not how closely did you align with the Common Core, because we started doing this before there was a Common Core. The goal is, are your standards clear so teachers can actually understand what you're talking about? It's not just some of the vague, happy notions that I kind of read off before. And also, are they rigorous? So ultimately, based on looking at what the best states in the country have done and what the best nations in the world have done in terms of getting results, also looking at what the best research shows gets results in math and in reading. How are you doing starting in kindergarten to make sure you're on a trajectory that by the time you graduate from high school, you've learned enough content to be ready to do college level work, or go to the military, or get a job. So it's also, one final thing I'll just point out, these standards, just like the standards North Carolina had before, are a floor. They're not a ceiling. Students have exceeded the old standards, will continue to exceed these standards. So it's not if you look at these and say, well, I know plenty of students who blow that out of the water. Absolutely. But we want to make sure, at the very least, all students are doing this.
Yes, follow up.
What I'm asking specifically is this team that you're referring to, who's on the team? Because in our development of the standard course of study, what's traditionally been done is we use our colleges, universities here in the state as a team with teachers and then parents, et cetera, to develop our standards to try to create continuity between the K-12 going into the university to try to address some of these problems. Are these university professors that are on your team that have evaluated these two curriculums, or what exactly are their qualifications, what do they do?
Mr. Brickman?
So I can get you a list. I think there was a large list, depending on the year, depending on the subject area. Again, I'd be happy to get that to you. But basically, these are content level experts who are experts in the fields of either mathematics or English language arts. That's separate, and important just to draw the distinction. That's separate from the group that, like you're describing, development process for North Carolina's old standards. The development process for the Common Core, quite similar, in that there were higher ed leaders, there were experts in content, there were classroom level teachers, and then, as Dr. Pierce pointed out, once the standards were written, there was consultation with people across the states, and before they were adopted in North Carolina, there was consultation just with people in North Carolina, the types of people you mentioned, to make sure that they were appropriate standards for the state.
Thank you. Senator Tillman.
Chairman, thank you. Mr. Brickman, thank you for your shared expertise here with us, but I have at least two questions. The first one is, you're familiar, I'm sure, with the NAEP, National Assessment of Education Progress.
NAEP,
It's a worldwide test. It's taken by many countries and all over the United States, 3rd grade and 8th grade. Are you familiar with how we scored on those tests in reading and math in 3rd grade and 8th grade in North Carolina?
Mr. Brickman?
Sure. So the NAEP, the NAEP, I believe is commonly referred to as the Nation's Report Card. That is the state-by-state comparison, where I believe North Carolina was average, slightly above average. But then the international test, which you might be referring to, the test that was just released within the last month, that's the PISA test. And that's the one that compares the U.S. to our international peers, and in a word, we didn't do so well.
North Carolina did pretty well. If you'll check again, especially on the NAEP. Now that means that our standards may not have been as bad as we are assuming they are. But aside from that, on the curriculum, if you have standards, that drives curriculum, which drives the test, which drives all of your teaching. If you buy into the standards, you are automatically going to buy into those. I think that's a given from everything I've read and everything I've seen. That being the case, how much wiggle room in curriculum, because if you ask any of our experts in this room who will talk later, they will tell you we have great latitude in the curriculum. What latitude does a state have if you buy into the Common Core standards? How much latitude in curriculum can you tell us?
Mr. Brickman?
Sure. So the first issue with the NAEP, I think it's...
This is on the Common Core standards. Every state selects its own curriculum, we're told. How much wiggle room do you really have in picking those materials in that curriculum? That goes with the national standards.
Sure. So with regard to your second question, I'll take that first. Absolutely the same as what districts, teachers had before. North Carolina had academic standards prior to the Common Core. I went through the differences in the quality of those standards, but the difference in the local implementation, what books are assigned, what lessons are given, ultimately what curriculum is in place at the local level, that's a local determination now as it was before.
Senator?
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, follow up.
Well, if that's true, we're being told that you only have wiggle room to add 15% to the curriculum. You can't take anything away. Now, if you could pick anything, any curriculum you want to, and try to get it national standards, you're going to see that you're not going to make the mark. So you're going to be into a particular curriculum that will teach the body of knowledge you need to do well on the test that will see if you meet the standards. Otherwise, you'll be all over the ballpark. So that's going to necessarily drive us into a particular curriculum. So I'm sure when our folks from DPI talk, they'll be able to address that a little more concretely, because it makes no sense to me to say you have the freedom to take any curriculum you want, but you got national standards that you've got to meet. Does that make sense that we could pick anything we want as our curriculum?
Mr. Brickman?
Absolutely, and I appreciate you asking that question, Senator, because I think that's a misconception that's out there a lot. And it goes back to the presentation that Dr. Pierce gave before, and the distinction between standards, which are determined at the state level, curriculum, which is determined at the local level. Now, absolutely, there's a relationship between the two. If you have a curriculum, districts can adopt whatever curriculum they want. But if the curriculum that a local district chooses ends up in producing results where students aren't learning, they're going to have to answer to the parents and the community who wants to know why students aren't doing so well.
You made my point. Thank you.
Any further questions from the committee at this time? Seeing none, thank you very much. And Mr. Brickman, if you please remain here, of course, so we may have at the end some more questions that arise as we go through this process.